new possibilities. And today our guest will talk about new ways of worship at his church here in Austin. Stay with us for Austin Faith Dialogue.
This is Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program discussing the important crossroad of religion in life, produced by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues throughout our area. Now, today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
We're glad you joined us today for Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Sandy Wilder, one of your hosts, and we'll be talking about a local church that's done some really exciting things in ministry and what influence it's having on the life of the congregation and their life here in Austin.
And my name is Shane Whistler, Associate Pastor of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, and your co-host for today's episode of Austin Faith Dialogue. And we are visiting with Pastor Sid Hall, who is pastor at Trinity United Methodist Church. And Sid, we're glad you're with us today and would like to begin with you telling us a little bit about yourself and about Trinity United Methodist, and then about the alternative worship services you have.
Thank you. I've been at Trinity for almost 8 years now, and a United Methodist minister, originally from Indiana, but been in this part of the country since the early 80s. And Trinity is a church that is located in the North Hyde Park area of Austin, and was looking for some ways to regenerate, looking for some ways to be creative and to reach out into the community, and specifically the Hyde Park area, but the community at large. And I think that we were ready to try some different things, to look at the needs of the community, and then base our worship and our ministry more from that than beginning with our own agenda.
Now, Shane mentioned something about alternative worship. Describe what you all mean by alternative.
Well, of course, in the United Methodist Church, where worship can be in so many different forms, alternative is really sort of a misnomer. What we meant was an alternative from the traditional style service that we were already having. And we decided that we wanted to reach out to a different group of people, people who shared in the same values, the same kind of mission and vision, but who wanted a different kind of worship service, one that didn't sit in pews, one that sat in a circle, one that looked toward bringing the body back into worship, more a dance, one that focused on the arts, not just music or even drama, but looking at what it would mean to have a worship service that conformed to the creativity of artists, rather than having artists conform to the framework of traditional worship.
Okay.
As pastor, you're charged with designing and leading the worship for the congregation. And you said that we were visiting earlier about your theology of Easter that you bring and your vision of what the church is, and how does that influence the way you lead worship and incorporate other people leading worship?
My theology of worship and theology of the church in general is that I really like Paul's metaphor of the church as the body of Christ. Even though he knew that the church wasn't perfect and the church had all sorts of struggles and faults, he dared to look for the risen Christ embodied in the church, and even called them saints, knowing that sometimes they weren't. And he had a vision that the church really could embody Christ, that if we wanted to find the resurrection revealed, we find that in the embodiment of ministry, in the embodiment of the community. The model that I looked to most closely was liberation theology and the models that Central America churches had set forth, particularly the emphasis on base communities. In the midst of oppression, in the midst of struggle, in the midst of needing to be a voice and a presence in the face of that oppression, base communities emerge from down below, or from the people themselves. They're planted where the people are, and as such they become a voice of hope, a voice of resurrection in the midst of a whole culture that is often entombed.
Is this based on personal experience, say travels to Central America? I just wonder how liberation theology captured your interest.
It's so many different influences. I began really studying the whole issue of Jewish-Christian relations, actually, and trying to understand what it meant to have a theology after the Holocaust, and looking at particularly the silence of the church during the Holocaust, and wondering what kind of complicity was alive, or maybe not, that's not the right word, but what kind of complicity led to the silence while people were murdered in their own midst. There were many righteous Gentiles who spoke out, but there were also many others who did not. And I guess looking at seeing signs of that same complicity in our own society and in Central America, in issues of different kinds of oppression, racial oppression, oppression against gays and lesbians, oppression against the poor or the homeless, looking at those different ways that it still continued to manifest itself in our own society, and then also noticing that the church, though it spoke out, often was reluctant to move out, to step into it, to actually become unequivocal allies with those oppressed groups. So what would it mean for a church to embody that, to embody Jesus' ministry, to step into the zones of oppression and speak a word and embody a spirit of liberation? And I think that's the motivation. That's where that began with me. The local church becomes a way to play that out in a practical mode.
That shows the kind of the driving energies behind your spiritual journey and sharing those with at Trinity United Methodist. Getting back to the worship, what specifically might a visitor see and experience at this worship service that's a break away from the traditional mode of worship in a United Methodist church?
Well, I've been really influenced by some of the alternative ways of looking at worship, particularly by people like Matthew Fox, who sort of put me in touch with the mystics within our own Christian tradition, the mystics who saw all of creation as an expression of divinity, and dared to even look at those that were considered the least of these, as Jesus would say, as expressions of divinity, as expressions of God. And so what that means is recognizing that the earth is not something to be depreciated, it's not something to be put down, and neither is the body. And to find ways to dance with the cosmos, to dance with all of creation as an expression of one's spiritual journey, and to do that through our own bodies, not just through our words, which has been the principal means of worship, at least in the Protestant tradition. And so what we try to do is have a lot of different art, a lot of creativity. We have guest artists each week, different people who do everything from dance to pottery to poetry to music, storytelling, and feel like that's sort of the centerpiece, that creativity reminds us all of our own creativity. And I believe that when a community can be creative in the arts, they can also find creative channels for justice-making and peacemaking in society at large. And so that's the emphasis of our worship. We have what we call body prayers, where we actually do movements. My original vision was to do them different ones every week, but that was, even for an alternative crowd, it was just a little too risky and pushing it too much. But what's happened is over the 3 years that we've had this worship service, the groups the group of people themselves, as they've come in and as they've become a part of the congregation, have given feedback on what they're looking for. And so the worship service really doesn't look much like I envisioned it when it started, but it truly is the work of the people, which is what the meaning of liturgy is. Anyway,
Who do you find then that's coming to the alternative worship service? Who's it speaking to?
mostly people who have not been churched for quite some time, have been outside of the framework of traditional spiritual communities, but who may have been, and I say may, some have not been raised, but may have been raised in somewhat traditional communities, looking for a way to re-mythologize, to reconnect with the spiritual community loosely of their origin, but to do it with the values that they have taken as they've become adults, the values of justice making, the values of inclusiveness and diversity, the values of looking at the world holistically, and of being responsible, seeing ourselves as interconnected, not separate from groups that are oppressed in society at large. That's the principal group that has come in, and not just in our alternative service, but also in our traditional service. But this particular group is looking for a way to worship outside of that traditional mode.
You know, it reminds me a lot of, since we're in the season of Easter now, it reminds me a lot of the new community then that must have formed in what has now become the Christian church right after the Easter experience. All sorts of folks that you wouldn't necessarily have expected would respond to this call.
I think that's really true. I think that if we were to be able to go back and look at the first century and the church under a lens, close lens, we might discover that there was a multiplicity, sort of a multiple way of doing community, and that every community would have their own, some of their own indigenous expression blended in to that which they had heard. And they were in the midst of creating something absolutely new, but not completely new. I say absolutely new in their own minds, but they drew from that which they already knew, already understood, and pulled in their own experiences in pre-Christian society. And I think that gave the early church a vitality, also a great diversity, and some of the conflicts that came up later expressed that diversity. But there was a richness in that, a sense that this is a movement, not an institution, that they're in a process of becoming, not that they've already arrived.
And in a very real sense, that's obviously happening at Trinity, if even in just the 3 years you've seen growth and change.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Well, we're going to break for a little introduction to Austin Metropolitan Ministries for folks who may be tuning in for the first time.
Great.
So
Wonderful.
we'll come back for some more conversation in just a moment. So stay with us as we continue to explore the new life, the creativity happening in one local congregation here in this exciting season of Easter.
Serving Austin means serving you. That has always been the primary goal of Austin Metropolitan Ministries. We are religion in action through the work of these organizations. Each plays a key role in making the capital city a better place to live, but we can't do it alone. Do you have some spare time, talents, or any resources that you can share? If you do, please call AMM at 472-7627, because serving Austin means serving you.
Hello, and thank you for joining us in Austin Faith Dialogue this morning. My name is Shane Whistler, Associate Pastor of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, and we're your co-host, along with Sandy Wilder this morning. We're visiting with Sid Hall, pastor of Trinity United Methodist Church. We've been talking about the alternative worship services at Trinity United Methodist Church. You said earlier that it's really reached out to primarily the alternative service to those who have been unchurched, or maybe those who haven't been in touch with church for a long time, and that the service is really kind of driven by the creative spirit that people bring to the congregation in this particular worship service. What have people told you about how this expression of worship has enriched their faith lives and their spiritual journeys?
I think people, what I've mostly heard is that they've reached a certain point in their life where where they're wanting to make a spiritual connection. They're wanting to make some connection with the divine, with God. And though they've often tried various alternatives, often outside of Christianity itself, you know, our traditions, our past carries a pretty strong voice in our unconscious, in our own experience. It's a part of our rhythm of life. And so when we push against it, it's still there as the shadow. This is sort of a way of entering into the shadow creatively, of naming oneself back into the tradition of one's origin, but doing it creatively. And I think that for the most part, I can say that it brings healing. That's what I hear more than anything. And it also provides a way for people to be in community and not be isolated spiritually, to connect with people who share in similar values, similar understanding of the world, a similar way of being a part of life. And I think it fulfills mostly that kind of mission.
Speaking of mission, I know in the best of all situations, worship is just the place where we come to get recharged, basically, re-energized for whatever it is we do out in the world. What kinds of effects on the life of the congregation and in the community around Trinity are you beginning to see from the folks who gathered for this new worship?
Well, I would say that the effects in the greater community are not just from the alternative worship, but from really, we now have 3 worship services that all 3 meet in different locations, actually, really trying to use the base community model for the way we form community. And I think that what we've seen happen is that as we've tried to be an extroverted church, as we've tried to look at the community at large and look at the needs, and then try to be faithful to how we envision embodying Christ or embodying Jesus' ministry through our own actions, through our own work. What we've seen is that spiritual community reaching out in incredibly effective ways as activists, as people involved in various causes in the community.
For instance?
We have a group of people that go to the work corner every Sunday and not only feed the homeless there, but have become friends, are a part of their lives, really feel a connection with them, and recognize that where at first this may have been a ministry to the homeless, there's a mutual kind of ministry going on where they are empowered, they are enlivened by the beauty in the people in our streets that are often invisible, or we choose to make them invisible. Another expression is a few years ago, Trinity became what's called a reconciling congregation, trying to look at what it meant to be faithful to Jesus' ministry manifested in the present. We decided that we wanted to become a church that made a public statement saying we welcome and affirm gay men, lesbians, and bisexuals. That it wasn't just enough to say we're inclusive, but we were going to have to actually live it out, so that if a gay couple came to church and wanted to express the joy of having their 25th anniversary, we would ooh and awe the same way we would a straight couple. And that we would we would be allies 100% for who they are, and find ways to live together creatively and as expressions of divine love. I think that those two things, also our work in issues around Central American oppression and the way that we try to use inclusive language, gender-inclusive language in our worship, all that becomes an expression of the vision that we have of how society can be, that God's realm actually is present, and that the diversity of our community becomes an expression of that, hopefully.
Right.
It sounds like what's been created here, the community, is one that recognizes God's gifts to the individual. Each person is unique and has gifts and talents and a character makeup that is theirs and God-given, and they bring that into worship and expressions of worship. And then recognizing that we are not just individuals and everyone's doing their own thing, but we come together as a body of faith, Christ's body, and act out the compassion and justice of Christ in the world. And that sounds like a very strong driving force in the identity of who the folks are at Trinity. You mentioned there's 3 different worship services. Some people, we always strive to be one big happy family, and in reality we can't be best friends with 100 other people or more than that. Some people say that each worship service creates 3 different congregations, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we tend to associate with smaller groups that we can relate to. How's that played out at Trinity?
I think you're right on target with that. Even churches where all the worship services are in one building, oftentimes people become faithful to those particular worship services and become communities in and of themselves in the larger community. I think that the glue that holds a community together is not the same building, is not the same worship style, but it's in sharing a common vision, a common mission, understanding themselves as a people together, and the leverage of their prayer life, the leverage of their activism in the community, the leverage of their commitment to that vision is the glue and is the energy really that drives them. And I think that that's what we're trying to achieve. I mean, there are struggles. It's hard when you do have 3 different locations. We have to be real creative in finding ways to come together through church-wide activities, through various, we have what's called Care of the Soul groups, where people meet in homes that represent people from all 3 different services. But I think that when there's an intentional effort, that does help to reinforce that vision and that energy, and people can feel like they're one community.
You've talked a lot about new and different ways of doing things at Trinity, which seem to be responding to a deep hunger in people. What do you see now as the growing edge for Trinity, or for the people who call themselves Trinity United Methodist Church?
I think that the growing edge is learning to continue to struggle with and be faithful to the vision that we have of diversity. We are not as interracial as we'd like to be, and I recognize that in my own study of race relations in Austin, that I-35 continues to be a major obstacle. It's like our own Berlin Wall. It's that it is more than mythical. It actually has a history of division that was a part of the Austin Charter. I think to some extent, as until we form a base community in East Austin, we will not see that interracial diversity the way we want. I think that is going to be one of our biggest challenges. I think that that recognizing that transportation is an issue for many people of color speaks to some of why we are not as racially diverse. I think our own racism, our own fears become blocks that we have to break through. I see that as probably our biggest challenge in the future as a congregation, but it is one that we are willing to step into and break open and look at all the sides of it, and to become part of that vision, just as we have begun moving in the issue of gay and lesbian inclusion, and the issue of interracial families, and the relationship to having the homeless population as a part of our community. All those things require just a constant focusing on the vision and willingness to step out and break through the barriers within.
You've talked about a number of things that are growing edges or points for Trinity United Methodist, but I think could say that just as well for the city of Austin as a whole. They have this period of rapid growth and so much change, and make sure people aren't left behind, and make sure we can, along the ways of building up, we can break down some walls and do some rebuilding of the community.
Yes, I think one of the misnomers is that we think that we have to be in ministry to these particular groups. But the real dynamic is once we get in the mix together, we're in ministry to each other. There is a mutual kind of liberation that happens, a mutual kind of emergence that happens. And I think that the base community concept in Central America, why that is so important to the concept of resurrection, is that it becomes a symbol of that hope. It becomes a way of actually stepping into, in a practical form, in the oppression and the pain that is around, and then breaking that open and becoming a symbol of hope. And I hope that we can embody that, not just on Easter Sunday, not just in our alternative forms of worship, but in the whole embodiment, the whole way we move into the community at large.
We have just a few more seconds here. I wonder if there's one last brief message that sort of sums up who and what the people call Trinity United Methodist Church are.
Boy, that is the only thing that I can say, and I think in summing it up, is that that it can't be summed up anymore. It is really hard to pin anything down. I feel like that we are a movement in some ways. We're in a process of becoming. And family systems theory says that when someone steps into the system, the whole system rearranges itself. I feel like that's what happens in our own community. Each new element, each new person, each new kind of art and creativity recreates the whole community. And that's frightening and scary, but it also is very exciting. And it means that who knows what we're going to become. Our goal is to be faithful to the mission and to the vision.
And that is exciting. Thank you for joining us on Austin Faith Dialogue today as we've talked to Sid Hall about this movement that is Trinity United Methodist Church, doing some exciting things in the Easter season. We hope that your Easter season begins a new movement in your life also. We'll see you next week on Austin Faith Dialogue.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472